Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to MindFlex. This is part 2 of the 4 elements of an empowered life. So, if you joined us last night, welcome back. If you're joining us tonight for the first time, welcome. So happy to have you. What we're doing over here is really giving over some of the key points from my new book, which is called The 4 Elements of an Empowered Life, available now from Mosaica Press, the wonderful Mosaica Press, and you can check out their website and pre-order the book if you'd like, and it's going to be coming to a Jewish bookstore right near your house. So check it out when it's out, and I'm excited to be here with you tonight to share with you more of some of the main points from the book. A quick recap of what we spoke about last night. We gave somewhat of a foundation of the 4 elements. If you're not familiar with the 4 elements, we have already, going back to ancient traditions, this writing that matter can be broken down or categorized as either earth, water, wind, or fire. Now, the way that we might say it now in sort of more scientific terms is everything exists in one of those states as being either a solid or a liquid or a gas or like plasma or pure energy. But what we're speaking about, what's relevant to us in our conversation, is not necessarily the elements as they relate to physical matter, but the inner world of our elements. And we mentioned last night that many of the ancient Kabbalistic writings throughout the ages have discussed our inner worlds, comparing them, our attributes, our character traits, categorizing them with these same categories of earth and water, wind, and fire. And this is a theme that we see very much as we explore Jewish mysticism, that we like to see our inner world, as well as the spiritual realm, as always a reflection of the physical realm. The truth is that it's actually the opposite. It's really the physical realm is really just the outermost layer of a deeper spiritual structure. So it will reflect that the same way that if I were to make a jacket, or if you were to make a jacket, or when we purchase any clothing forms, it's in the shape of our bodies because it is the outermost layer, the outermost covering. And therefore, just like a jacket has 2 arms, that's just because I, the human being, have 2 arms. So therefore, within the world of Kabbalah, of mysticism, of deep Jewish theology, we see the same thing. We look for patterns. We look to the external world to understand, oh, this is what's really going on a much deeper realm. Or again, vice versa. We could look at the deeper realm and say, okay, because it works like this, that's why this expresses itself like this in the physical world. So when we see that everything categorizes itself within these 4 categories, within these 4 elements, we know that it is a reflection of our inner world. And therefore, our mission, our purpose in this world, and I know you want to save the world, you want to make a big impact, you want to do something great, and you will do something great. But doing something great in the world begins, the way our mission begins, by looking inwards and saying, how do I become, how do I transform myself to become the best version of myself? You can be changing the world, but if inside we're not thriving as becoming the human being that God, that the Almighty wants us to be, then perhaps one might say, as I am saying, that we're not fully accomplishing our mission. We're not fully accomplishing our mission because we are here not just to transform the outside world, but to transform the inner world. And that's really very much the premise of the book. And once we see, as we spoke about in the previous session, once we are doing that work and we are showing up to the world as our best selves, something amazing will happen. And that is that our mission will become clear. The doors will open. We will attract our mission. We will attract opportunities to us, but it begins by becoming our best selves. And therefore, we want to look inwards. We want to understand our core struggles as human beings and say, okay, if that's what I need to contend with, then I can do that, I can become that, and therefore I will accomplish my purpose, my mission in this world. Okay, so again, as part of our recap, we mentioned last night that there are 4 elements. There's the element of earth, and we spoke about how the element of earth represents the inner realm that's connected to our physical bodies. So it's mainly concerned with our mortality, with our safety, with our security, with living, with making it to the end. That is the sort of the lowest rung on the ladder, represented by the element of the earth, the most primal, the most basic aspect of being a human being or being a living creature on this world is to want to make sure that you have proper sustenance. So that is the realm inside of us that is called the earth element. Then we have the water element, and that is the next rung on the ladder. Because now once we feel comfortable that we have a roof over our head, we have what to eat, we have proper sustenance. So then we look around at this world and we think to ourselves, you know what? We're not just here just to make it to the end. We're here to have a meaningful life, to have a joyous life. So we get to the next realm, and that is the emotional realm. The emotional realm is where we begin to evolve, not just as just being here for the sake of staying alive, but that we want this to be a journey. We want this to be an experience. And at this point, we start looking not just to stay alive, but we look for pleasure, we look for relationships, we look for connection. We look to make this a pleasant journey while we are here. So that is the next rung on the ladder, represented by water. Then, as we go higher to the next rung on the ladder, we get to wind. And wind represents the world of our thoughts. The same way as you see, as we're climbing the ladder, we're getting to less and less mass, more abstractness. So as we get to wind, we speak about the world of our thoughts, and just the same way that our thoughts sort of, they're always passing, right? The monkey mind. We always have ideas and thoughts going through our head, our mind, our brain. And sometimes those are meaningful thoughts, and sometimes those are silly thoughts. We spoke about the realm of wind also as being the realm of communication, because communication is the expression of the intellect. So that is the realm of wind. And at that level, we're looking even beyond our relationships, but over here, we're actually looking to search for truth. We want to become knowledgeable. Knowledge is power. We want to understand. We want to become deep. We want to really know the meaning behind things. That's an even higher rung on the ladder. And then at the top of that, we have the element of fire, which represents our will, our desire to self-actualize, to become something, to not just go through this life even in a meaningful way, but actually to provide meaning, to become somebody, to know that we're leaving the world a better place than we found it, to know that we're leading others, that we're including others in that journey. That exists on the next rung of the ladder, which is considered the element of fire. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. We also mentioned that the great Kabbalists, especially to quote Rabbi Chaim Vital, who says that within each one of these elements, there's going to be a negative expression of it. There's going to be a negative manifestation of it. So therefore, because Earth is mostly concerned with our survival and mortality, there's always going to be this concern that maybe there's not enough. There's going to be a certain sadness, anxiety, right, that looks around and just says, what am I doing this for? Does the world really provide? Am I going to be okay? Is everything going to be okay? Oh my gosh, what's going on? The world is falling apart, right? Everything is terrible, and we have diseases that are coming and destroying the world, and what's going to be, everything is falling apart, right? That is the earth element inside of us that creates that fear. And from that fear comes depression, sadness. From that fear comes laziness. Why is this really all worth it? From that fear creates jealousy. It creates the strife between human beings because I suddenly look at everybody else as a threat to me. So Rabbi Chaim Vital says that from the earth element is born those traits of sluggishness, of depression, which include laziness and sadness and jealousy. Rabbi Chaim Vital then says that the water element, because it's focused on pleasure, which is a beautiful thing, right? We know that we are here to have a pleasurable and a pleasant and a beautiful and a wonderful life with deep, meaningful relationships and enjoyable experiences. But there's also the negative expression of that realm of water, and that is that maybe I'm going to become too indulgent, too addicted. Like we mentioned last night, there's a chain reaction because once the earth element expresses its negativity, its anxiety, its concern, its fear, its laziness, then we try to drown that out by indulging in pleasure. And that could become addictive and damaging as well. So those two realms are very much connected in that sense. So our goal is to refine those elements, refine the element of earth, refine the element of water inside of us, that we know how to properly use it. And that's going to be what we're going to speak about a little bit more in tonight's class. We then have, again, the next rung on the ladder is the wind element. And Rabbi Chaim Vital says that the same way that wind is looking for ideas, it wants to know, it wants to understand. But in that very same realm of ideas, we can get distracted and we can start getting into things that are really irrelevant, just curiosity for curiosity's sake, but without any meaning. We can be deceived. We can get caught up in a world of false information and fake news and all sorts of distractions. Our conversations, instead of becoming meaningful, can be wasteful. He says specifically that the wind element corresponds to dvarim betelim, wasted words, wasted conversation, small talk, chitter chatter, yenting, as they say in Yiddish, right? Yenta is a Yiddish word. It's actually a name. And if your name is Yenta, I apologize for bringing this up. This is probably a sore subject for you. But, there is a name, Yenta. But for some reason, in Yiddish, they've decided to use this name as sort of this way of saying someone who is, into the gossip, into, the what's news and what's going on with this one and with that one and all of the comings and the goings. So that's also like the wind, it's all over the place. But we're looking to refine, to channel the element of wind to what it's supposed to be used, and that is consistent, deep learning, meaningful conversations, etc. And then we get to the element of fire, and the element of fire, like we said, because it's there, because I want to become something, I want to self-actualize, I want my name to be remembered. So Rabbi Chaim Vital says that the negative manifestation of that is going to be arrogance or ego. Because we know that everyone wants to be somebody, and you can either genuinely become somebody, or if not, then you'll have a long life trying to convince everybody that you're somebody. And we do that in all sorts of different ways. We do that by, maybe if I dress better, maybe if I have a nicer car, if I have a nicer this, if I have a nicer that, maybe if I speak down to people, maybe if I, walk around with a certain, kind of swagger, maybe people will say, oh, check him out, he's so cool, or he's got, those shoes or that purse, if he's got a purse. Whatever we do to try to impress on others that we are somebody might take away from the real journey to actually be somebody. And what the fire element does, therefore, because fire is the element that destroys to rise up, right? Fire can destroy other things, and fire always rises up. That's the nature of the human being, who can either destroy other people so that he or she are the only one left in their world that feels like they matter, or we can destroy the obstacles, also passion, motivation. That all comes as well from the element of fire trying to rise to the top in a much more meaningful way. So that is a really long recap of our previous session, and I know that a lot of people are just joining us now for the first time, so hopefully you're up to speed and this makes sense. If not, then you can check out the recording of the previous session. What I'd like to share with you tonight is the following. Where does all of this exist in the Torah? If I were to look in the Torah, because as Jews, we want to look towards the original playbook, the original blueprint of how to live a good life, right? We know that we believe that everything is supposed to be right there in God's manual. So if indeed our whole purpose, our whole existence is to overcome the challenges that exist in these four realms, to perfect and to elevate the four elements and live that empowered life, one would imagine that it would be a central theme in the Torah. Right? Certainly it should be. If this is it, if this is our main purpose here, to refine ourselves in this way, so it should be a central theme in the Torah. And in fact, it is. One might be surprised, but there's actually an entire book in the Torah about the four elements. And what am I referring to? I'm referring to the book of Bereshis, the book of Genesis, Sefer Bereshis. If you take a look at the book of Bereshis, Sefer Bereshis, and many of the commentaries have pointed out that the book of Bereshis is very light on mitzvot. There are not a lot of commandments there because the book of Bereshis is meant to be a foundation. Not a foundation because it tells us the stories that we need to know to be part of the Jewish people. It gives us a foundation of what it means to be a thriving human being. It's not the stories, but it's the lessons. Now, the Torah is a book it's meant for the young child, it's meant for the advanced Torah scholar. And because of that, it has layers and layers. And we need to peel away the layers to really understand the deeper message behind things. So therefore, for my children, when they're learning the book of Bereshis, they're learning the stories of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebecca and Yaakov and Rachel and Leah and the 12 Shvatim, the 12 sons. So they're learning these stories and they're learning, the stories are exciting and we try to extract a lesson here and a lesson there. But for us, for adults, for those who are familiar, hopefully, with the stories already, for us, we need to start looking at the deeper meaning behind things. And whenever you're trying to extract, to understand the depth behind anything within Torah, we want to once again look at the pattern. We want to look at the thread. If we look at the book of Bereshis as a bunch of disjointed stories, story here, a story there, 2,000 years covered in two Torah portions. Abraham has this adventure, Isaac goes through this, but they're sort of in these independent little stories. There are lessons in each one of those stories that's certainly valuable, but without seeing the full picture, without understanding how everything clicks together, we're never going to fully appreciate what the book is coming to communicate to us. What is the overall takeaway, the overall lesson of how we're supposed to build that foundation for the rest of the Torah, which is about becoming the Jewish people and the 613 commandments, etc. So we need to look at the book of Bereshis as one story, a story that begins with Adam and Eve being evicted from the Garden of Eden, and then the 2,000 years of struggle that came after that and all of those stories. And then how that world that had sunken into desolation and impurity was rectified by Abraham and Sarah, Yitzchak and Rivka, Yaakov and Rachel and Leah, their children. How they rectified that world and therefore created the foundation, set the stage for which the Jewish people would then be built by going down to Egypt and coming out and receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai and everything that comes after that. So we want to find that thread. And as I'm sure you can anticipate what's coming next, my suggestion over here, based on various different commentaries, is that the thread that is going to help us link together all the stories and paint a full picture of what's going on are going to be the four elements and their understanding of these different realms. And that's what I'd like to share with you. And then once we see that, now we can look at all the stories and say, oh, I get how that fits in. So this specific story is coming and it's related to that element. So therefore that's going to be the lesson, and that's how I can apply it. And that's how I can elevate that element. And then we have now a whole new world, a whole new way to appreciate this book that we've been learning since we've been children. So that's what I'd like to share with you. And again, tonight, it's short. It's hard to capture an entire book in a 45-minute class, 2 45-minute classes. So what I'd like to do is just give you a little bit of a taste, a little bit of an overview. And again, my hope is if you're watching this and you're enjoying this and you're intrigued by this, that you'll check out the entire book and you'll be able to really see it in the sources, because it's just so much more beautiful when you see it at length. But we don't have the time, so let's do what we can, at least to get an overview of how to look at the book of Bereshis according to the four elements. Perhaps you've noticed that early on, the Torah presents, like we said, the early evolution of humanity after Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, are kicked out of the Garden of Eden. We see that it's a progression, it's a downward progression. The world comes apart. Human beings begin to worship idols, to engage in lewd behavior, etc. But if you take a look, if you had to extract very specific stories that come early on in Sefer Bereshis, in the book of Bereshis, you want to extract specific stories and say, okay, these are the incidents, these are the events that the Torah portrays as being, as really showing how the world was coming apart. We see that there's really 4 main stories that show the denigration of humanity. Immediately after Adam and Eve get kicked out of the Garden of Eden, so we have the very first story, the first 2 human beings after that are Cain and Abel. And we know that Cain kills Abel. He kills him because he's jealous. Right? He's a worker of the earth. And he kills Abel. And he buries him in the ground. And God comes and God curses Cain. And he curses the earth. And that is sort of the first story showing that this post-Eden human being is one that's going to be deeply flawed, to the point that over here we have the first 2 siblings and this horrible tragedy happens. And that's incident number 1. And then the Torah goes on, and the Torah does mention some short incidents, but really the Torah doesn't give a lot of focus to anything else happening within the first 10 generations of humanity until it gets to the generation of the flood. And then we get to this generation with extremely immoral and lewd behavior, to which the Torah pretty much boils down to the fact that they were stealing, they were treating women however they wanted to, stealing each other's wives. As it says at the end of Bereshis, they saw the daughters of man and they started acting freely with them. And God destroys the world with the flood. And then after the story of the flood, the Torah again gives us a lot of names, a lot of generations, and then presents us with yet a third story. And that is the story of humanity trying to build this tower to go up to the heavens, to wage war against God in a way that the Torah does not clearly explain to us how they plan to do it. All of the Torah says is that they united by the fact that they had uniformity in their speech. And somehow, according to the commentaries, this speech, this verbalization, it was almost perhaps a verbal war. Somehow, this uniting of their language was the trigger for them to now architect this tower and this plan to wage war against God. And God says, I'm going to change your language so your plan cannot be successful, and I'm going to scatter you. You're going to be scattered amongst the land. So those are three major stories, but then there's a fourth one that comes a little bit later. And that is another a city, a generation, which we cannot ignore because it plays a major part within the book. I mean, it gets a lot of coverage in the book of Bereshis, and that is the city of Sodom. The city of Sodom is a very wealthy city, the most beautiful city. It says that it was Kiganash, it was like the garden of God. A beautiful city, but we know they were arrogant. And because of that, they looked at themselves, like we say in Yiddish, as besser mention. You know what the term besser mention? They were better than everybody else. And therefore, you can't come into our city. And they were hostile to people that were outside of their clique. Right? We know sometimes when people get very cliquey and you want someone else that tries to come in, no, you don't belong here. And that was the city of Sodom. They were extremely affluent and extremely proud of who they were and were not very receptive to outsiders. And God destroys the city by raining down fire on the city and completely pulverizing it. So those are these four different incidents early on in the Torah where we see a complete breakdown of humanity. Now, if we pay close attention to the pattern over there, we see that both the nature of the sin as well as the punishment that was given are very much connected to the four elements. Because if we take a look at the story of Cain, what was Cain's whole thing? He looked at heaven and he said he's jealous, and God comes to Cain and says, don't get down on yourself, right? Don't get all sad, don't get all depressed. If you get depressed, God says, if you get depressed, then sin will crouch at your door. The beginning, if you want to bring down this ship, the way to start doing it is get depressed, get down on yourself. Start looking at other people and saying, oh, I'm jealous of Abel. How come God loves him more than me? Cain kills Abel, buries him in the earth, and God says, Cain, you're cursed, and so is the earth. Because the earth element, by the way, Cain was called Oved Adama. He was the worker of the earth. Because what is the earth element? The earth element is that part of us that says the world cannot provide. There's no room for me and you. And then you get depressed. Then you get down on yourself. How come everyone else? How come I look around and everyone seems to be doing better than me? I look on if you're on social media and everyone seems to be just flaunting everything that's so right in their world. And I get down and I feel like I'm not enough. God says that's the beginning of all sin. So Cain corresponds to the flaw, the negative application of the element of earth. Then we move to the next story, the sin of the flood. And that was a sin of lustful behavior. Because like Rabbi Chaim Vital says, the water element, the emotional element inside of us, when it's not being properly applied, we know that when people are feeling lonely, when they're feeling that their relationships are not meaningful, are not powerful, what happens? They try to override those feelings of loneliness by indulging in physical indulgences. And that's what happens with the generation of the flood. They're lustful, and God says, if that's the case, I'm going to wipe you out with water. Mida kineged mida. Mida kineged mida is that the punishment always corresponds to the flaw. Because you sinned with immorality, your punishment is going to be a punishment of water. Okay, then we get to the next generation. And we said that the wind element is the one that corresponds to the intellect, cognition, as well as communication. And here we have a brilliant generation. They have the ability. Obviously, we're not speaking about cavemen here. We're speaking about very, very sophisticated human beings who actually had a plan. Which, had God not intervened, the Torah implies that they actually had some sort of plan to undermine God, to somehow create enough of a distance where they felt, okay, if we do this, God will leave us alone. And we'll be able to na'aselanu shame. We'll be able to establish for ourselves a reputation. We'll be able to rule ourselves, and God will leave us alone. That was their plan, and God had to come in and intervene and say, it's not going to work. You can't do that, and you'll see I'm still in charge. But again, it was from their language and it was from their plan to build a tower to go up to heaven. And that corresponds to the wind element, and therefore their punishment was God scatters them like the wind, right? To scatter them to all four corners of the world, to disrupt their language, which corresponds, like Reb Chaim Vital says, the wind element is dvarim betelim, is corrupt language. And their language had become corrupt. So God says, I'm going to destroy your language, that there'll be 70 different languages, and you'll be scattered like the wind to the ends of the earth. And then the next element, the element of fire, which is the element of arrogance and ego. Now we have the generation of Sodom, that they're cliquey, they're arrogant, they look down at other people, and God says, I'm going to destroy you with the element of fire. It's going to rain down fire. It's interesting that we know that there's references throughout that the city was turned into salt. In fact, Lot, who escaped, his wife turned into salt. We know that salt, at least in the, now we have salt on the table. We don't pay a lot of attention to it, but we know that salt in the ancient world represented wealth. People actually paid other people in salt. In fact, what I learned recently is that in Latin, the word salary comes from the root of sal, which is salt. Soldier is also from that same root, because they used to pay soldiers. You work for the country, you get paid in salt. So salt was always a symbol of wealth. So it was a direct, again, mida keneged mida. The punishment was appropriate for their trait of arrogance. And now they were punished by being destroyed by fire and turning into salt. So we see something profound, something beautiful, and something amazing. This is the beginning of the Torah. This is the stage of humanity being set. We know that everything that's going to happen with the forefathers, with the patriarchs, with the matriarchs, and then ultimately the mission of the Jewish people, we're always coming to fix these early flaws. The Torah teaches us early on, this is what you have to contend with. That means that for me and you, for you and I, for our children, for humanity, we're supposed to find our own struggles in these early stories in the Torah. Right? We all have a Cain and Abel inside of us. We all have a generation of the flood. We all have a generation of the tower. We all have a Sodom. These are the things that we have to contend with, not in such dramatic fashion, but the Torah is teaching us what we have to deal with as human beings. Now comes along the patriarchs and the matriarchs, the avos and the imos. And they say, okay, now it's going to be our job to fix those early flaws. And again, in just the limited time that we have, let's take a look. We know that Abraham and Sarah, what are they famous for? We know that one of the reasons that they became the founding couple of the Jewish people, right? They're the original patriarch and matriarch. What do they excel in? Chesed, kindness. We mentioned at the end of the last session that what Cain represents is what we call today in psychology a scarcity mindset. There's not enough. There isn't enough for everyone. Right? We're going to be limited. What's going to happen? The opposite of that is what's called an abundance mindset. There is so much. An emunah mindset. Hashem can give anything. We're not limited. No one else in this world is a threat. So much of the coaching that I do, The starting point of so many of the struggles that people have when they come is this person is this and this, and I have this person in my family, and this person and this, they're messing with me, and my boss, and the first thing is we're not a victim. You're not a victim. Stop putting the power into other people. Right? Take control. Abundance. Come into approach life from a place of power, from a place of what's called in Hebrew ravchus. And Abraham and Sarah, Avram and Sarah, they're known for the fact that they're chesed, that they have this abundance. Come, you join us. You're part of us. They look out at the world and they say, it's not us against the world. We want to join. No, there were other people that believed in God before them. Avram and Sarah were the first people to look at the world and say, we're a big family. Avram he's called Avram because he's Av Hamon Goyim. He's the father of the nations. He includes other people. Come into my tent. Let's talk. Let's discuss. Let's grow together. In the great book called Mesilas Yesharim, The Path of the Just, he speaks about the earth element. He says everyone has this earth element that tries to bring us down, tries to make us not take action. And he says that if you want to learn how to counteract the earth element, you want to learn how to overcome laziness, overcome depression, overcome sluggishness, it begins with an action. The way we say it in English is your motion, your motions, your physical activity ignite your emotions. Because in as much as the earth element is the element of the physical body that brings us down, that makes us feel heavy and sluggish and lazy, once we learn how to be more energetic, once we learn how to move, what the Mesilas Yesharim, what Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto calls zrizut, alacrity, enthusiasm, energy. Once we become more energetic, then we will find that the earth element, the earthiness of our body will fall away and we'll be able to overcome that. And if we look in the Torah, who is the Torah personality that embodies, that represents zrizut? Abraham. If we take a look at, we know there's that very, very famous story when he's serving the angels. He has the angels approach after he has his circumcision, his bris, and he's serving them food. This is really where we see his chesed, his kindness in action. And he is not only just a good waiter, a good maitre d'. We see he's always running. We'll take a look. Abraham runs here and runs back, and he's running away, and he rushes, and he tells Sarah, hurry up. Everything is quick. Everything is quick. And the Torah is trying to paint a picture for us of Abraham as being someone who's so full of life, so full of energy, so full of passion. Several times in the Torah it says Abraham woke up early in the morning. You know those people? Right? They wake up early in the morning and they're just like, excited. You see them, you come into work, they've already been at work for the last half an hour, and you're just halfway through your coffee, you're like, I need 3 more coffees until I'm fully functioning. And they're like, good morning, right? They're excited. They're excited to see you. You know those people who like the room can be like, okay, and then they'll come into the room and then everything lights up. They just have this effect, their energy, they shine. You know those people where everything feels tense and then they come into the room and everyone just kind of relaxes? That's the picture that the Torah is painting when the Torah speaks about Abraham and Sarah as being just so full of life. The abundance. They don't just do kindness. They do kindness with an abundance mindset. Right? They're so full of life, so full of energy. And there's many other examples as well, but that corresponds to the earth element. So where on the one hand you have Cain and Hevel, which is the scarcity mindset. Corresponding and elevating that is Abraham and Sarah, the abundance mindset. Then we move on. And again, and there's many, many references throughout Abraham and Sarah's life to the element, actually the element of earth, things that are woven into the verse that maybe you would not have noticed. But again, it would be too much if we got too much into text. I think that we'd go way over time. But let's move now to the next stage. And now Abraham and Sarah have children, Isaac, and Isaac marries Rebekah. And we know that what we mentioned before is that the next generation, the next flaw that had to be rectified, that had to be elevated, was the generation of the flood and their indulgence in pleasure. Their indulgence in forbidden pleasure. And we know that Yitzchak, what is the trait that Isaac embodies? Isaac embodies the trait of what's called Gevorah. And like we learn in Pirkei Avot, our sages say, who is considered a Gibor, who is considered someone who is the master of Gevorah, someone who is Kovesh es Yitzro, somebody who learns how to engage in the physical aspects of the world, but that it doesn't own them. They become the owner of their pleasure. They learn how to elevate that pleasure for holy causes. And we know Isaac, who embodies strength and discipline, Gevorah is discipline. One would expect that somebody like that might be someone who, orders dinner and says, I will just have a piece of bread and water. That's all I'm going to eat, and I'm going to sleep on a very, hard bed and everything like that. But it's interesting. Something very subtle. A few times we see Yitzchak engaging in pleasurable activities. We know that on a very simplistic level, and there's many interpretations to this, but it says that a lot of his relationship with his son Esav, the verse says, Kitzayid b'fiv, Esav would bring him food. We know that on his deathbed, he asked Esav, bring him food, and it was quite the meal. And again, there's many interpretations, but on a simple level, the Torah is trying to tell us, because we don't see this by the other patriarchs, the Torah is trying to tell us that Isaac, because he was a man of discipline, had the ability to elevate physical pleasure. And something that's very interesting is, because we mentioned that the water realm is the realm of emotions, the first time that the Torah speaks of the deep love between a man and a woman is specifically Isaac to Rebekah. Because whereas the generation of the flood viewed women as the objects of their lust, Isaac specifically, who is the master of the realm of water, who is the master of elevating physical pleasure. Somebody like Isaac, we get this picture of someone who was able to look at his beautiful wife Rebekah and understand the deep, deep love that can only come within the context of holiness and of sacredness. And because of that, it's specifically in the context of Isaac and Rebekah that the Torah focuses on that deep love between a man and a woman. And then we move on. And we had the next generation, the element of wind, which was the generation that built the tower. And then we come to Yaakov, who is known, what is his overall trait? He's the man of truth. If we think about what would be the opposite of dvarim betelim, of wasteful, of silly words, it would be truthful words. And Yaakov is the man of truth. Isaac recognizes him by saying, Hakol kol Yaakov. This is the voice of Yaakov. Yaakov is the one who sits in the tent because he wants to know, he wants to understand. And it's amazing because whereas the Tower of Babel, the tower, generation of the tower that built this tower, and the Torah says, the Torah understands it as a tower whose top reached the heavens. That language of something, of a structure whose top reached the heaven is said only by one other instance, and that is when Jacob has his famous dream where he's dreaming of a ladder. And where does that ladder? The top of the ladder reaches the heavens. Almost an identical language. And whereas the Tower of Babel, whereas the Babylonian tower, the generation got scattered, within that same prophecy that Jacob is seeing that tower, God says, I'm going to send your children to the four corners of the world. But not like the Tower of Babel, who were just scattered. Their goal is to go out and teach truth to the world. Because Yaakov, you are a man of truth. And therefore your children will teach the world how to face the truth, how to understand the truth. You'll challenge the world to think deeper. And then we get to that final level on that ladder. We get to the story, next we get to the story of Sodom. And the story of Sodom, like we said, they represented this arrogance. We're better. We're better than everybody else. And because of that, you cannot be part of our club. And now we get to that final level, the last stories in the book of Bereshis. The children of Yaakov and the children of Rachel and the children of Leah. And here we have the emergence of the two great kings, Yosef and Yehuda, Joseph and Judah. And each one of them spiritual giants in their own right, they become kings. And let's begin first and speak about Yosef, who becomes the viceroy of Egypt. And he becomes one of the great leaders of the region. In fact, that he's the one that's there to provide. And whereas one could expect, and here the Medrash points this out, the Medrash says that so many people, when they find success, what happens? They let go of God. What about Yosef? When Yosef, the Medrash says, Yosef becomes successful, and what does he say? Et Elokim ani yareh. I'm God-fearing. He never lets go. Pharaoh says, wow, check out this guy. Yosef says, it's not me, it's God. He always remains humble, and he always remains committed to God no matter how successful. And because of that, he becomes the conduit. He's now the one to provide. And then ultimately, Judah, who's also becomes all of Malchus, all of kingship will come from Yehuda. The Davidic dynasty will come from Shevet Yehuda. He becomes the king. And we know Yehuda himself, his whole development as a leader in that kingly role is one of becoming more humble, taking responsibility. The very name Yehuda means hod, the ability to say thank you, the ability to apologize, the ability to take responsibility. That's what it means to be part of Yehuda. Yehuda is the embodiment of both fearlessness but also humility. And therefore from him will come King David HaMelech, who's also going to embody that very same fearlessness and also humility. And by the way, it's no coincidence that if we look back at David's roots, besides for being from Yehuda, we know that he also comes from Ruth, who is a Moabite. We know that the Moabite nation was the children of Lot, who came from Sodom. Because David is the rectification of that trait. Whereas Sodom, they viewed their success as a way to put everybody else down. Jewish kingship was about fearlessness and humility. A fire that burns, a fire of leadership. It says that the house of Yosef is like a fire, right? A fire of leadership that doesn't destroy, but a fire of leadership that includes, that leads, that looks to get other people involved. True leadership to make the world a better place. So we see again throughout the story of the Torah that the Torah is teaching us through all of these stories how to elevate, how to rectify, how to uplift these four elements. We're certainly out of time, and there's so much more to be said about the topic and how to properly apply it. And I hope that at least this Torah part resonated deeply with you, and that you'll inquire to learn a little bit more about it. And I encourage you once again to check out the book, delve into this a little bit more deeply, see how it applies to you practically. Every single one of us has certain traits, certain struggles that are more dominant, and we go through that in the book as well as how to create a practical plan to take all these things and apply it to our life mission. I thank you so much for joining, and again, I'd love to hear your feedback. You can always reach out. Thank you once again to Project Inspire for this wonderful program and for a full year of programs, and hopefully we'll connect sometime again soon. Have a great night.